All right, we're back once again. It's 3 o'clock here in San Diego. I'm sorry, not 3 o'clock. My apologies. It's 1 o'clock here in San Diego, 3 o'clock on the East Coast. We're at the ASU GSV Innovation Conference. I'm pleased to be talking to Richard Miller, who is the president, perhaps most importantly for our conversation, the founding president of the Olin College of Engineering in metropolitan Boston. Rick, thanks for joining us. And you were present at creation. I mean, there's a lot of conversation at this conference and in higher education these days about the need to innovate. You had the good fortune, I assume, I hope, that you were given a blank slate and a lot of money, $500 million, as I recall. It wasn't quite that simple, to say, go build a new model for engineering education. Is that sort of a fair place to sort of begin to frame this conversation?
Yes, well, I would say my wife has always told me I'm not smart enough to know how much trouble I'm really in, and this is a good example.
Yeah.
So I was the first person there, besides the Olin Foundation, whose idea was to create this school. So the Olin Foundation is really quite well known. They have been philanthropists in higher ed for 50 years. There are 78 buildings on 58 university campuses that say Olin Hall. One of them actually is at USC, where I first met them.
Yeah, we should say just where you and I first met.
That's right.
About 25 years ago.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
We were colleagues there.
Yeah.
So since then, a lot has happened. I moved on to become Dean of Engineering at the University of Iowa, did all the things that deans are supposed to do in terms of building buildings, changing the curriculum, raising the research funding by 50%, and so on. But there's probably a genetic defect somewhere in me, because I continue to be concerned about what's happening to the undergraduates who are paying for most of what's happening at the graduate level. I got a letter of invitation from the F.W. Olin Foundation to consider being the president of this new school that didn't exist yet. When I went, Olin was not yet a place. It was an idea. The 4 directors of the F.W. Olin Foundation and me were the ones who sat down and thought about what we could do. Yes, they did have plenty of funding. This is really unusual for a startup, not having to be strapped for cash on a daily basis. On the other hand, I found that there's a flip side too. No one gives away $500 million without having very strong ideas about what they want. In this particular case, none of them is an engineer, and none of them had ever worked in higher ed. So what can go wrong with this? This was a quite interesting startup. We needed to fix engineering education in particular. So maybe I'll tell you a little about why.
Let's talk about exactly that, because I was going to circle back to the issue of what they wanted versus what you, as an engineering professor, as a dean, and as the president doing the design, felt that engineering really needed, and what that gap might have been, and how you resolve some of what would have been those different perspectives.
Yeah, so
and the time frame we're talking about now is roughly 15 years ago. Is that?
Yeah, I was there in 1999.
Okay,
and at that point we had nothing.
No and the planning process from that first meeting of the 5 of you to the day the first students arrived.
So I arrived on essentially St. Patrick's Day in 1999. We broke ground on the campus buildings in May of 2000. We hired our first faculty in September of 2000. Taught our first classes in 2002 and graduated our first class in 2006. We graduated our 10th class last May.
Congratulations.
So that's basically the trajectory there. So why did they do this? Why would they spend so much money? And the bottom line is there's a lot of unhappiness about the way engineers are prepared in this country. And engineers matter. It turns out that a very small number of them determines a large fraction of the GDP in this country. And less than 5% of the bachelor's degrees in America that are awarded anywhere at any university will go to any student who majors in any kind of engineering.
We should add also, I think, there's large numbers of students who think that they want to begin their academic careers as engineers, and there's a large fall off for a lot of different reasons. Some are not well prepared in terms of the math and science. Some feel it's not an engaging culture, and some often feel that there's just not a support that helped me to succeed, as opposed to you and I've had conversations of what we might characterize in some places, certainly not at Olin, a misguided meritocracy of pushing talent out as opposed to encouraging talent.
Well, there's the old culture in engineering which developed in the 1950s after the Sputnik that look to your left and look to your right, and one or both of you won't be there, only 1 out of 3. So today even, about 40% of the kids who start in the fall to study engineering will succeed. 60% will not be there ever to graduate in engineering. By the way, most of those who leave have grades that are higher than the ones who stayed. So they're not flunking out. It's the way we're teaching them. We describe that, or a good colleague of mine describes that as the math science death march. It's the way we've developed the curriculum. So in the first 2 years, you have nothing that looks at all like engineering. You do instead math and science, and relentless for 2 years. It's as if you are not qualified to pick up a wrench until you have an associate's degree in physics and calculus. Have you ever heard of the Wright brothers? These guys invented the aircraft industry. They did it as bicycle mechanics in Ohio. They were not physicists. They invented the field of aeronautics without having all those prerequisites. So among the things that we have discovered through experimentation at Olin is that engineering, in fact, is not a body of knowledge. Now, it involves knowledge, don't get me wrong. When you buckle up in that airplane to go home tonight, you're going to want to make sure that the kids who designed that plane actually knew how to calculate the stresses. Nevertheless, it's not a body of knowledge, it's a process. And the process involves experimentation. What those Wright brothers did was jump off a mountain with some wings on their back about 1 million times, every time crashing, saying there must be a better way, going back, making some modification and trying it again, understanding what they could about why it fell short. That is the process of engineering. It turns out that
Trial and error.
Yes, iterative, learning from your mistakes, trial and error, and developing theories as you go. That's how everything that's made is made today. If you look at the curriculum, what we're teaching, though, it's only, in most institutions, it's the last course that you take before you leave. Now, we've come to develop an analogy here that helps people understand what's wrong. We believe that engineering is not the same thing as science. An engineer is a person who envisions what's never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen. It doesn't start with math, it starts with vision. It has a lot more to do with the arts than it does with the sciences. Obviously, it involves science, but the heart of it and the soul of it is in the arts. So we believe that engineering is a performing art. And in fact, our whole curriculum is developed that way, so that at the end of every semester, we have a recital and every kid has to stand and deliver. The average student who graduates from the school completes 25 projects. They present a prospective employer with a portfolio of 20 pieces of hardware and videos of the thing working. Oh, and yes, a transcript in the appendix, not just a transcript. Really, if you think of it, the way most schools teach engineering today, and I would argue more than engineering, a lot of the subjects that are being taught in universities today
include computer science in that?
Computer science, natural sciences, mathematics, possibly even a number of the social sciences.
Well, even med school, where so much is science intensive in the first year,
yes,
as opposed to healing medical physician kinds of experiences.
So here's the way it would go. If you had a young child who was a prodigy in the violin, and you sent them to study music at a music academy, whose curriculum was developed in parallel with the way we teach the hard sciences today, the first year, they would study exclusively the physics of vibrations of strings. We would learn about mode shapes and natural frequencies and pitch and timbre and all that stuff. And the second year, you would learn about the theory of music. So you would learn about melody, harmony, point and counterpoint, tempo. In the third year, we would teach you about orchestration, so how to blend the voices with the woodwinds, with the percussion. Oh, and in the fourth year, if you're still here, we'll give you a violin, and we'll teach you to play a scale on the violin, and we'll give you a degree in music.
I want to come back to something you said earlier, and that is in terms of, it's not about science, it's about vision. As I think it's also some of our collaborations and what I've read about Olin, it's also about collaboration in one sense. That the traditional engineering curriculum is very much you solo against the world, or potentially you solo against the professor. And that there's a structure at Olin that is very different than that in terms of it's a model based on collaboration and the sum is more than the parts. Is that true?
Exactly right. Because there's something very unusual that happens when people learn in teams. Turns out, by the way, if you go to Boeing and you ask them how many engineers does it take to make an airplane, it's more than 5 or 6.
So that's sort of a setup for a joke.
Yes.
But it's not. But it is or it isn't?
It's thousands.
It's thousands, of course.
Okay. Because of the detail that's required in all of the parts. And the coordination of that effort is the big deal. So one of the things that we learned, and I think it's a very simple idea, if you have 4 or 5 kids that work together on a project, the learning momentum is maintained at a speed which actually feeds acceleration of the learning. If you learn alone, it's long been known, if you are taking calculus by yourself and you get stuck on problem 1 and you're not going to get your homework back for a week, you even forget what problem 1 was before you get the homework. If you're working in a team of 5 or 6 and you're doing the same thing, one of them says, hey, when I got there, I did this and it unlocked the door. And you keep working in that group of 5 or 6, and it turns out to be a sweet spot where this momentum of learning continues and it accelerates.
I want to shift a little bit to the notion of Olin as a catalyst for other parts of the engineering landscape, particularly undergraduate education. So the college is now 15 years old. You've first group of degrees in 2006. This is the 10th anniversary of essentially the first group of graduates. You and I were talking before that you get a lot of calls, you get a lot of queries, you get a lot of campus visits. Clearly, in the context of what engineering education is, undergraduate engineering, we should be very explicit. At Olin, you've got command and control over that environment in terms of where you see opportunity, notions of continuous quality improvement, a lot of things that we know ought to occur in higher education, but don't. Mm-hmm. How has Olin been a catalyst for change in the broader landscape of engineering?
Number 1, we have redefined it. Number 2, we've modeled
redefined it for who?
For the engineering profession.
Okay.
For 650 universities that have visited us since 2009 who are all inspired and want to try things differently themselves. So we're giving them permission to try new things. Secondly, the results that we've gotten are stunning, and they are very inspirational to people who say, but if we change, we'll do damage to the kids and they won't actually be able to engineer things. Well, we can pretty much prove that that's nonsense, that we are presenting example after example after example of kids who are able to perform way beyond even what students in the most traditional environments can do. One of the things that, so let me explain that
You live by the shadow of MIT, given Boston,
mm-hmm.
in terms of one of those very somewhat traditional or very traditional kind of mm-hmm. engineering environments. Harvard just got $400 million from an engineering mm-hmm. school. So it's not like you're an island. There's a lot of shadows that occurred both in the Boston area, let alone nationally and internationally.
Mm-hmm. Which is exactly true. It's been really a godsend to be so close that we can simply catch the apples that fall off of the Harvard and MIT
okay.
tree. The first group of 10 faculty that we recruited, 2 of them resigned from MIT to join us after teaching there for 10 years. We had recruited 3 from Vanderbilt who had been there, including the associate dean and the head of electrical engineering. We recruited the chief scientist at NASA Goddard Research Center. We recruited a woman who is a concert pianist who late in life became concerned about electronic music, earned a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT, teaches part-time at Juilliard, does some CDs that she's composed. When we found her, she was teaching circuit design at MIT, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and music theory at Tufts on Tuesday and Thursday. An interesting group of people, which would have been very difficult to assemble, say, on the prairies of Kansas. So Boston is essentially the Route 128 corridor, is essentially the Silicon Valley of higher education. And students love to go there. It's easy to recruit students into that domain. So this is the primordial soup that generates life for new startups in the education space, which is great. But Olin's founding precepts, what the foundation wrote as the purpose for the school to begin with, is that Olin is intended to become an important and constant contributor to the advancement of engineering education in America and throughout the world. So the fact that we can do this on our scale in a small elite institution is irrelevant. It's only if we can inspire and to categorize change in other institutions that we matter. So we began working with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign a few years ago. They came to us and asked for some help. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, they completely changed the undergraduate program in engineering to incorporate many of the principles that we're doing at Olin. I mean, it's not about copy Olin. It's about experiment with an open mind the way Olin did with your own student body. And you too will find insights that work in your environment that don't work elsewhere.
But I suspect that in one sense, the Olin experience gives license to others. The traditional model would be, let's look at MIT, let's look at Stanford, let's look at a couple of other places, Caltech, mm-hmm. as these are the paragons, these are the models, and our goal is as much as possible to clone or to emulate. Again, I think about a little bit, I know about the early history of Olin. The catalog, when you went out to begin to recruit the first cohort of students, had a bungee cord. The message was, come take the ride. Come take the great leap, sort of an existential leap. And I suspect you got some students who might have had other options at those more traditional institutions. How much license do you really provide?
Olin is a blank slate. So preserving that culture of bold innovation is our greatest challenge now. So Olin has no tenure for any faculty member. That was a premise from the beginning. We have no academic departments, which is a much bigger change than not having tenure, it turns out.
How many faculty?
About 40 at this point,
Okay.
regular appointed faculty. We have a like number of additional faculty who are in the adjunct area that actually have engineered things.
That might be the size of one department at a more traditional place under an engineering school.
Exactly. So Olin is intended to be a test tube, and it's intended to fail fast and to quickly make change, which we've done many times. In fact, we completely reinvented the curriculum 3 times before we graduated the first class.
And how many times since?
Oh, it's hard to count.
Okay.
Now it's really continuing. We have a major experiment in complete revision in the curriculum going on every summer.
So it's more of a model, if I may, continuous quality improvement as opposed to sort of 0.5, 1.0 on a 5 or a 10-year cycle.
Yes. There are other really interesting educational experiments around these days, some of them that I'm very familiar with and very fond of. But they have a concept that they're going to replace the fundamental notion of what an education means today with content knowledge to something else that deals with skills and abilities. They create a static vision for what that content is like, and then they develop a curriculum around that. Olin is completely different. Olin assumes that we know nothing about what the curriculum is going to be in 10 years. All we know is that everything at Olin has an expiration date, including the curriculum. So while this was very literal at the beginning and now is essentially continuous as it goes on, the curriculum doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to everyone, including the students.
All right. We've got to close. I want to end with one question, though. So for the places that would like to do what Olin has done, whether it's in engineering or other areas, again, you've had the great gift, the great opportunity to say, here's a big check and a blank slate. That's a rare opportunity. Whether it's a future benefactor that wants to be the next Olin in engineering or something else, or for a state that says we need a new kind of college in a new kind of way. What are the 3 most important things to consider in terms of this kind of launch for the next? Minerva's here. They're talking about they've got a very different model. What are the 3 things to consider if, in fact, you want to be a benefactor, or somebody who takes on the role that you did as the founding president and herding the cats towards a new vision?
Well, number one, a lot of the things that we're doing are not necessary. I'm absolutely certain of that. We're doing them because they can be done, and it's our mission to do everything. And we're finding, as we did with Illinois, very little of that is actually necessary. Even a small amount of it will make a huge change. Number 2, for those who are intimidated by the fact that Olin happens to have a large endowment, and therefore we couldn't possibly do what they do, the 2 pieces of advice I give everyone in every university that costs absolutely nothing can transform undergraduate education everywhere. Number 1, ask your faculty to sit through the courses that you assign the students to take.
Okay.
It's one of those Yogi Berra things. It's amazing what you can see by looking. You think that this is a very coherent experience where what they learned in this semester fits perfectly with what they learned in that one. From the student's perspective, they make almost no sense at all. And a lot of just-in-case learning doesn't stick anyway. Number 2, whenever you hire new faculty members and bring them in, for the first year, assign them to work in teams with faculty members from a different discipline. That changes the entire nature of the role of the faculty member in the classroom.
You're talking about an acculturation.
Yes, it winds up being, you are no longer the sage on the stage who knows the answers to everything, but in fact, it's more like a meet the press kind of debate.
Yeah.
And it keeps students engaged, and it's student engagement that transforms education.
Great. Rick Miller, thanks very much for joining us. It's a great story about Olin.
Great. Thank you, Casey.
Great. Much appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break. Next up with me is Bill Goodwin, who is the president of Discovery Education.